Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. I hope you're having a very, very good weekend. And let's say hello to our co-host, Jay Copley. How are you, Jay?
Doing very well. Good to see you and everybody. Thank you.
Nice to see you, too. So, folks, I'm going to be delivering the talk this month off camera. So I want to invite you to just relax, sit back, and I will be back with you after the talk when we move into the writing and our Q&A. So here we go. We are going to be looking this month at the importance of keeping some kind of a Sabbath. A Sabbath is a day when we put aside our ordinary activities, we unplug from the technological world, and we focus inward, connecting with God or source or true nature, whatever we call that spiritual essence of who we are. Sabbath is a time for creating inner sanctuary and for pausing in our overstuffed lives. It's an opportunity to drop out of ordinary time, out of the tick-tock of routine and repetition, watching the clock, in order to come into a deeper state of being. Now, Sabbath keeping has been a part of spiritual traditions around the world for millennia, of course. In the Judeo-Christian world, it began with the commandment that was given to Moses by God in Exodus 28 to keep the Sabbath day holy. Among Jews, it became known as Shabbat and came to symbolize the rest that God took on the seventh day after 6 days of labor in creating the world. This extended to other parts of Jewish life, including the tradition of Shemitah, which mandates that every seventh year, a field needs to lie fallow. In other words, for 6 years, they plant, they plow, they prune, they harvest. But in the seventh year, these activities are forbidden, and the field lies fallow. Because without that, the soil doesn't have a chance to renew itself. The Sabbath is first and foremost a day that isn't about earning, selling, or producing. Okay? It's focused instead on spiritual connection and renewal. And that not planting in the seventh year is a metaphor for that. In the Christian tradition, of course, Sunday has been seen as the Lord's Day. Many Buddhists observe Uposatha, which occurs every 7 or 8 days in accordance with the 4 phases of the moon. There are other versions of the Sabbath that are observed by Muslims, by Sikhs, Baha'i, Zoroastrians, Wicca, as well as Native American tribes, including the Cherokee. The cultural creation of weekend, what we think of as the weekend, is the secular version of Sabbath. It's meant to symbolize this sanctuary time. But unfortunately, the concept of weekend lacks the spiritual component in a secular culture. Instead, the idea of sacredness is replaced with the pursuit of pleasure, which is very important and very necessary, but not the same thing. Sacredness and worldly pleasure serve very different purposes in the mandala of what it means to live an integrated human life. Now, we live in a culture that leaves out major parts of this mandala, the holy colors, you might call them, as well as practices that are explicitly focused on connecting with spirit. One of these practices is ritual, as we've talked about before in the Seekers Forum. Last month, we explored the cost of not having rituals for aging and how that leaves us impoverished and confused very often about how to frame this period of our lives. Another loss is the ritual of Sabbath keeping and setting the intention of regularly making part of our week sacred by design. Rather than viewing the Sabbath as a form of self-care, we too often think of it as prohibitive in religious terms. For example, the blue laws that forbid the sale of alcohol on Sundays. In this light of forced abstinence, Sabbath keeping can feel like an imposition. It can feel like a forced period of deprivation in lives where many of us already feel overworked. It can be seen as time that's taken away from quote unquote real life, instead of the opposite, which is what it actually is. Sabbath is time taken away from the man-made dimension of clock time, achievement, doing, becoming, in order to step into the real life of spiritual presence. Now, when we fail to do this, we lose something extremely precious. As this month's interview guest, Rami Shapiro, reminds us, at least 1/7 of life must be about non-performance and non-egocentric pursuit, or else we forget our life's purpose. 1/7 doesn't seem like a lot to ask for the one thing that can give us lasting peace, which is connecting with our own true nature and God, however we define that spiritual source. Rami quotes from the 14th century mystical text, The Cloud of Unknowing. You only need a tiny scrap of time to move toward God. Isn't that beautiful? A scrap of time. And yet even this can feel like a stretch in our overstuffed, overstimulated lives, which begs the question, if we're unable to commit to that, to 1/7 of our lives, what does that say about our values? We have no trouble valuing our to-do lists, producing, performing, jumping through the hoops of society, or our pleasures or escapism. But valuing downtime for spiritual renewal, that somehow feels like one thing too many to do. Instead, we may find ourselves charging from day to day, measuring our lives out in coffee spoons, as T.S. Eliot put it, and hardly stopping to take a breath. Now, as someone who loves to work, I have a lot of experience in this particular area. A while back, I was telling a friend that my life was feeling overly full. And even though I enjoyed almost everything that I was doing, I felt like I could really use a silent retreat. When he asked me how long it had been since I'd taken a retreat, I admitted that it had actually been over a decade. What I didn't tell him, and realized only afterward with a little bit of shock, was that not only had I not gone on retreat, but I hadn't actually taken a whole week off in something like 11 years. It seemed impossible, but it was actually true. 11 years. I didn't think of myself as a workaholic. It's just that I was very absorbed with what I was doing, and I allowed my work to dictate the rest of my life. I forgot what I knew about spiritual self-care and the necessity to take a real pause on a regular basis on the path of being, in my case, a writer and a teacher. If I was honest with myself, I had to admit that this wasn't an accidental forgetting. In fact, it was a choice. The truth is that I was hyper aware of the clock ticking louder and louder as I got older, in the sense of time running out. When I felt tired, I bucked myself up with the quote from Ecclesiastes, "Work now, for the night is coming." Or the rallying call of George Bernard Shaw. As George Bernard Shaw put it, I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. For the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch, which I've got held up for the moment. And I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. I didn't want anything left either. I wanted to use myself up. But I also didn't want to never stop. I realized that I needed to create some kind of sacred space where nothing got done and time could stop for long enough to really catch my breath. The metaphor of the breath is extremely important because, of course, respiration shares an etymological root with inspiration. There can be no inspiration, no inhalation in the sense of really taking life in, without deep exhalation. As I began to slow down, I was aware of how often I was holding my breath. I was aware also of another voice inside of me. It was a humbler, smaller voice underneath the heroic tones of Ecclesiastes and George Bernard Shaw. This voice wasn't speaking to me in words. Instead, it was more like a moan that was coming from deep inside my body, almost like the sound of a wounded animal. It wasn't excruciating or severe pain. Instead, it was a subtle, visceral ache, like the quiet desperation that Henry David Thoreau talked about. When I looked at this desperation, I saw a long suppressed desire to empty my overactive brain and touch the sacred core of my life. I longed for silence most of all, to stop the flow of external information so that I could unplug from the time-driven world and go inside where there was some stillness and some quiet. Now, you undoubtedly know what I'm talking about. You have your own version of this feeling of overwhelm when the onslaught of external stimuli are uninterrupted and you start to feel like you're drowning, like you can't catch your breath. You can't fully exhale. In our overstimulating world, we badly need a timeout, a regular period that's free of demands, free of technology, when our brains aren't being whiplashed by the contradictions and the fascinations of the material world. We need a time to reflect, to get simple, to get quiet, and to do things that bring us joy, as opposed to mere pleasure or having fun. Things that create love, healing, and connection to God. Because when we do this, it brings something that we don't often experience in our lives, and that is equanimity. The Buddha said that a mind filled with equanimity is abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. Equanimity, he said, is reached by stepping back and seeing a bigger picture with patience and understanding. This enables us to, quote, stand in the middle of all this, unquote, which is the literal translation of equanimity, to be able to stand in the middle of all this and remain centered in the center of whatever is happening. Now, this is only possible when we take the time to get out of the river, step out of the maelstrom, and sit on the banks of the torrent of our existence. Otherwise, we're forever caught in this river, in this maelstrom, getting banged up by the rocks and scratched and thrown around and tumbled down waterfalls and stuck in trees. When you keep a Sabbath, it enables you to step out of the river and to sit on the banks, to dry yourself off, to patch up your wounds, and to reflect on things, to stare at the sky, and most of all, to stop trying. Stop trying so hard. This comes as a huge relief. There's an end of struggle, and there's an interruption of desire. And that's what enables us to fall out of time, so to speak, to leave the world of push and enter the beautiful realm of the pause. Ancient philosophers called this pause time nunc stans, as opposed to nunc fluens. Nunc stans is the eternal time. It's the eternal present. It's the now moment that never ends. Nunc fluens is temporal time, clock time, where things are passing and moving and becoming. Okay, those are two very different experiences of time. As the 6th century Roman senator Boethus said, the now that passes produces time. The now that remains produces eternity. Isn't that beautiful? The now that passes produces time. The now that remains produces eternity. Stepping out of nunc fluens into nunc stans is like taking that giant breath that we've been missing and settling into eternity. Now, we can create whatever kind of Sabbath we need, so long as it provides a container in which to attend to things that we may miss out on for the rest of the week. And that can be anything from meditation to gardening to spending time with loved ones. Whatever it is that feeds your soul and does your heart good is what you want on your Sabbath diet. So, how do we create a Sabbath practice? What does it mean to make a Sabbath of our own? I'd like to just offer a few suggestions to think about when you're considering whether to do this in your own life. And remember that these suggestions are open to improvisation and they need to work for you. Okay, so just take what's useful and leave the rest. The first point is that the Sabbath should be a whole day, if at all possible, from sundown to sundown, whatever day suits your schedule. We need a good chunk of time out, considering how hectic our lives are. The next thing is I suggest taking off your watch and covering your clocks. Now, that may sound extreme, but we really do need to wean the mind off of its addictive clock watching. We are so attached to the passing of time that it will really help to take your watch off and stop looking at clocks for 24 hours. The next is to begin the Sabbath with some kind of a ritual, whatever appeals to you. It can be lighting candles, it can be saying a prayer, it can be journaling, it can be reading something beautiful, walking outside on the grass, anything that helps you to sequester this time. That is the point, is you're creating a container, and a container requires limits. The next is to create some kind of Sabbath intention for yourself. You can do that weekly, or it could be an overall intention that you bring to your Sabbath time. Basically, it's your promise to yourself and the universe. The next point is to avoid large social gatherings. You don't need to be alone to observe a Sabbath, but you do want low stimulation. Ideally, you might try not socializing with anyone outside of your home, for example. Remember, the point of the Sabbath is to maintain an attitude of self-awareness and reflection, which are hard to have when we're in group settings. The next suggestion I have is to create a worry box, a box or a folder or whatever it happens to be, where you could put your cares and preoccupations that come up for you during the Sabbath aside for the moment, with the promise to attend to them later with love and care. Okay, we can't turn our minds off. We're going to have thoughts. We're going to have worries. We're going to have plans, things we've forgotten. Put them in your worry box and know that they will be there when you need them when your Sabbath ends. The next is to be conscious of what you eat. Be conscious of what you take into your body. Try not to order out or go to the supermarket. If possible, cook something for yourself. Really take some time. It doesn't have to be gourmet cooking, but it should be done with love and ideally with your own hands. That has a very healing effect. The next is to avoid technology and screen time. This is huge. I don't need to talk to you about addiction to technology. We all know what technology has done to our lives and to our brains. So this is maybe the most important point on this list, is to turn your phone off, get off social media, get off screen time, just be with the real world for 24 hours. The next point is to avoid places of commerce, whether you're buying or you're selling. Remember, this Sabbath is about not profiting, not gaining, not having ambition. It's a time for us to lie fallow like the fields in the Jewish Shemitah tradition. Let ourselves be fallow. We don't have to constantly be taking in, or giving out. The next is to keep your intoxication to a minimum. Sabbath isn't party time. It doesn't mean that you necessarily can't have a glass of wine with your dinner. It's simply that this is not a time for checking out, it's a time for checking in. Next, surround yourself with beauty and love. Okay, whatever that means to you, beauty and love. These should be the tenor, create the tenor of what the Sabbath is in your own life. The next is try during the Sabbath to do some kind of gratitude and forgiveness practice, whatever that means to you. For some people, it's keeping a gratitude journal. It can be writing, of course. You can do self-inquiry around gratitude. What are you grateful for? What gives you joy? And forgiveness. How can you forgive yourself? What can you let go of? What ill feelings can you let go of regarding the people in your life? Next, practice self-care. That really is the essence of this. So focus on healing and wellness, on lightness, on spiritual and emotional hygiene. Next, during the Sabbath, try to do one kind thing for someone else. Okay, it can be any act of love, any act of compassion or empathy, one kind thing. Show a kindness to someone during your Sabbath time. And finally, close your Sabbath with some kind of prayer of intention for the week. This does not have to be a religious experience, but it ought to be an intentional one. We're setting a tone for the rest of our week. We're taking this deep breath that we've gained in keeping this Sabbath into the rest of our lives. Ideally, we want to integrate the qualities of Sabbath into the rest of our lives, not just save it for our one day off. So create an intention for the rest of your week. And finally, it's important to remember that this is a practice. There are going to be weeks when you have to change the day or shorten the day. There will be other times when your life will simply interfere. But by maintaining this intention, not to let a week go by without a chunk of Sabbath time, you are making a commitment to yourself and to the spiritual core of your own life. This is such an important point in this hectic, crazy world that we live in. So I would like to challenge you this month to try, at least for August, to keep a Sabbath, a weekly Sabbath for yourself in a way that appeals to you and in a way that works for you. And let us know how it works. I'd love it if we could do this as a group. So if you'd like to write to me, if you'd like to check in, if you'd like to attend the guided writing sessions this month, which are going to be all about the Sabbath, these are always to support one another in this really difficult and very important exercise of taking time out to connect to the God of our own choosing. So, Jay, why don't we pull up the card and let's do some writing? I'd like you, please, now just to take 15 minutes to describe the kind of Sabbath that you would benefit from the most. What kind of Sabbath would you benefit from the most? And if the prospect of keeping a Sabbath doesn't appeal to you, why is that? Why is it? What are your stories, perhaps, about what Sabbath is that may cause resistance? Now, be as specific as you can be, please. We will take 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back together as a group.